Today, new tools and instruments for private land conservation in Europe. And we have a very interesting number of panelists, of speakers, all of them experts on new tools and instruments for private land conservation in Europe. Let me say you, this event is hosted by the European Landowners Organization and by the Nature Conservancy, both partners in the Land is Forever project, a preparatory life project, which is paid by the European Commission. The question of today: has the European Union the necessary tools and instruments to enable private landowners to play an important role in the realization of European biodiversity goals? And as you're all aware, the European Union 2030 biodiversity strategy proposes that 30% of the total land area in Europe should be protected. And let it be clear, this is only possible with the active participation of private landowners. So the question: do we have the necessary tools and instruments to ensure this participation? And it's exactly in this framework that the preparatory Life Plus project, Land is Forever, private land conservation tools and their use were studied. And during this webinar, you can discover those tools, their specificities, their use in the United States, and whether they are appropriate to use in the European Union. The main aim of this event is to present the audience a set of tools which we believe could be effective to engage more European private landowners in nature conservation, and of course to open the discussion with the speakers and the audience commenting on this set and criteria of success. So the idea is to have a clear guidance after this webinar for impactful policy recommendations at European level. The program of today consists of two parts. First of all, we have a number of presentations on very promising tools. And in the second part, we have asked a number of panelists to give us some feedback on the tools and instruments that we have presented. And of course, there will be time for you, for the audience, to interact and ask questions. The first part of today, I can present to you four speakers. First of all, we have Phil Tabas. He is a senior special advisor for the Nature Conservancy in the United States and an absolute expert in tools and instruments used by private landowners within the United States. We have Tilman Disselhoff, president of Eurosite, and he was coordinator of a project on private land conservation, and is the coordinator of the ENPLC now, the European Network for Private Land Conservation, in which the two former preparatory life projects are joining forces to check what we can offer to as well nature conservation NGOs as private landowners. Thirdly, we have Anne-Sophie Mulier. She's project officer at the European Landowners Organization, and she is the coordinator of the preparatory life project Land is Forever. And last but not least, we have Jan Mensgaard. He's the expert in the field of nature conservation and, let's say, new nature legislation, which is active in Flanders. He's working for the Agency for Nature and Forest, an agency of the Flemish authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can start. And our first speaker, Phil Tabas, the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, and it's my pleasure to be here to share with you some of the experience of the Nature Conservancy in trying to work with private landowners in the US. Next slide, please. Just a word about the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy was established in 1951, and we have basically 70 years worth of experience of trying to work with private landowners for conservation purposes. The mission of the Nature Conservancy is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we had the pleasure of supporting the work of ELO in the Land is Forever project by conducting survey research and focus groups and policy analysis to try to help understand landowner preferences for private lands conservation tools in the context of the European situation. One of the things that the Nature Conservancy brings to this experience is that we own and manage directly ourselves 2.5 million acres of land outright, and we hold another 3,100 conservation easements covering 3.4 million acres around the world. So our experience grows out of being a landowner directly. Just to paint a quick picture of what the profile is of private land in the U.S., the National Conservation Easement Database in the U.S. collects information about conservation easements throughout the country. And as of 2020, there were about 32 million acres of land had been protected through the use of conservation easements. And just to explain a little more about the context of that, about half of that acreage was protected by conservation land trusts working throughout the country, and about 20 million acres was protected through the outright acquisition of land. So land trusts are a very important partner in the effort to protect private lands throughout the U.S. Just to put that in context, easements have protected about 1.5% of the land area in the U.S., and that stacks up against about 12% of land area in the U.S. having been protected by a number of other conservation tools. So we have a ways to go to get to the goal of 30% by 2030, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. So just to give you a picture of what the components are of private land in the U.S., it consists of certain kinds of tools. We have the benefit of having extensive natural features information about the location of plants, animals, and natural communities. We have the benefit of having created interest in land through the use of conservation easements, and we're going to be talking more about that later. And the extensive programs to acquire land outright for conservation purposes. We also have a number of cost share programs that provide benefits to cooperative management agreements that benefit landowners and allow land to be managed for conservation purposes. Another element of our programs for conservation in the U.S. have to do with finances and incentives. The Nature Conservancy, the U.S. has benefited from extensive tax incentives for gifts of conservation easements, and those tax incentives are at the federal, state, and local level. We also have extensive federal and state cost share programs in which the government provides money to private landowners to help them manage land and shares the cost and expense of restoration and management for those lands. And finally, there's a growing development of impact investments and sustainable development investments that provide a return on land that is used for conservation to private investors who have invested in conservation activities. The final element of the profile of private land in the U.S. involves the institutions that are involved in that work. And as I mentioned, land trusts play a critical role to work with private landowners as a trusted partner in the effort to try to protect private lands in the U.S. They bring expertise and resources to bear and to work with private landowners to help manage land for conservation purposes. And they hold conservation easements. They are a charitable organization under U.S. law, and they have the benefit of being able to accept tax-deductible conservation easements. In addition, public agencies play a critical role by providing funding and management expertise to help land being managed for conservation purposes. Next slide, please. Just to try to summarize and give an overview of what some success factors are for why private lands conservation is so popular in the U.S. There's a tradition of private property and private action to accomplish public purpose goals in the US. We also have the benefit, as I mentioned before, of extensive and reliable conservation science information to map the location and extent of plants, animals, and natural communities, and to develop information about how land has to be managed in order to achieve conservation outcomes. Another element has been the growth of the land trust movement. Back in 1980, when the tax deduction for conservation easements was established, there were about 200 land trusts in the US, and now there are some 1,400 or 1,500 land trusts working with private landowners throughout the US to protect land. Another element of success relates to the fact that we have many examples of locally initiated approaches to funding for conservation programs in the US. These are ballot initiatives that local communities have enacted to adopt and tax themselves to raise money to fund the efforts to protect land. And then another element of our efforts that has accounted for our success has to do with an approach to conservation that reflects a landscape scale perspective, and that is to try to bring a broader perspective to identified geographic areas, as opposed to working on tract by tract approaches to protect land. And by having a larger landscape scale approach, it allows communities to work together, even if they have different approaches, to accomplish conservation outcomes. And finally, I would attribute the success of the conservation in the US to availability of a wide range of tax incentives for private landowners. These are incentives that reduce your income tax, allow land to be transferred from one generation to another at a reduced tax burden, and allow land to be owned and managed at a lower tax burden for property tax relief. And so these incentives all provide a way to incentivize good behavior by landowners to accomplish conservation. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we face in private land conservation in the US, all is not rosy. We have our own challenges here. One of the challenges has to do with climate change and meeting the challenge of perpetuity. In many respects, we know that climate change will affect the location of the conservation targets that we have. And so we have an effort ongoing here in the US to try to identify resilient landscapes. That is to say, lands and waters where nature will be moving, so that we can anticipate the changing climate and changing location of nature. And the Nature Conservancy has developed maps of this resilient and connected landscape to show where land will be needed to protect in order to accommodate the changes that we anticipate in climate. Another challenge we have is to accelerate the pace and scale of conservation. As we all know around the world, the effort to accomplish the 30 by 30 goals is an important goal, and the US has begun an effort to identify how and what resources are needed to accomplish the 30 by 30 goals for the US. Another challenge we have is we recognize that conservation is not solely an objective of landowners, that landowners have a need to use their land for economically compatible uses. And we look at finding the sweet spot between conservation and economically compatible uses as another challenge to meet our goals for conservation. And then finally, one of the changes that's happening is excuse me, a changing focus from the threat of development and fragmentation as a target of conservation to a greater interest in seeing restoration and habitat management as the focus for conservation. It's less about trying to stop development and prevent fragmentation, and now it's trying to maintain ecosystem function and ensure that riparian areas, wetlands, and other features of natural diversity are protected to maintain their ecological function.
So can I ask you to come to a conclusion?
Yes, good timing. I have one more slide. If I could go back 1 second. I guess I can't get to the last slide, but the last slide I was trying to make the point that just some advice that we've learned from the U.S. conservation experience had to do with providing clarity and certainty about conservation outcomes, trying to balance landscape goals with individual conservation actions, ensuring that public resources were sustainable over time in terms of being able to finance the conservation over a number of years. We think it's important to build robust partnerships between the private landowners and the land trust community. And we think it's also important to find incentives and rewards for positive conservation outcomes as an element of any conservation program that's being established. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tilman Disseldorf.
Thank you, Phil. And indeed, our next speaker is Tilman Disseldorf. He's the president of Eurosites, and he's at present the network coordinator of the Preparatory Life Project ENPLC. Tilman, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you very much. And a very warm welcome from my side. Thank you to the organizers of today's event. I think it's very important that we as all kinds of stakeholders, public and private stakeholders, come together to work on solutions for furthering biodiversity conservation in the EU. You've already seen half of my slides, but I'll go through them with you again anyway. I'll just quickly introduce to you the concept of conservation easements that Phil has already alluded to in his presentations, and you could see from the very impressive figures that Phil presented how successful conservation easements have been as a tool in the United States. 32 million acres protected under easements. That's roughly 13 million hectares. I'm not good enough at math to tell you how much that would be as a fraction of Natura 2000 in Europe or so, but you can see it's a considerable acreage, and certainly an instrument that we want to look at more closely. So what is an easement? Let's go to the next slide, and I'm not sure if I should do that. I'll do that. I'll click on my cursor and see what happens. Nothing much. Then I'll leave it to you, Marie, to forward the slides, if that's okay. Thank you. So an easement is basically, it's a tool from property law. So this exists in basically every national legislation around the world, in the civic codes mostly. And it's sometimes called easement, it's sometimes called servitude or covenant, or has multiple names, but it's basically a legal agreement between two parties, legal parties in that case, that allow for transfer or restriction of use rights linked to a property without the transfer of the entire ownership of the property. The concept behind that, the legal concept, is that of the bundle of rights that come with land ownership. And I know that some legal scholars also use the metaphor of a bundle of sticks. So this is why I have a little image of a bundle of sticks there to remind you of that. And you can basically untie the bundle and take out any stick that you need. And that stick may represent the right to sell the land, to bequeath it to your children, or the right to use it, the right to exploit it, so to extract resources from it, and so forth. So all these rights are individual, and they can be transferred individually. And the easement transfers the certain use rights from one party to the next. And you are all familiar with the concept, for example, when you have power lines on private properties, the right for the power company to maintain these lines and to have them run across your property is very often legally codified in an easement. Now, the idea of using easements as a conservation tool is about 100 years old in the United States, and it's basically using this property tool for conservation purposes, so to restrict use rights on a property that somehow interfere with the conservation values of that property. Next slide, please. Now, the idea is quite ingenious, and there are a couple of typical characteristics that come with conservation easements that I want to point out here to explain to you why it has become so popular in the United States and why we think it has so much potential in the European context as well. First of all, it's voluntary. So that is obviously attractive for everyone who does not like to be told what to do, and that's pretty much all of us. So doing something voluntary is always better than being forced to do something. So this is attractive when it comes to the implementation of conservation policy, but it's also important to know that regulatory approaches, they create a baseline, which we all have to adhere to. That's just the way we govern our societies. We have to adhere to rules, but it doesn't tell you anything about going beyond what is legally required. So when a landowner wants to do more than is legally required on his property, a conservation easement can be the right tool to voluntarily do that. So they are bottom-up initiatives, and they have very little interference by third parties or the government, which is also an important characteristic. Phil talked about the tradition of property rights in the United States and their general skepticism against public authorities, which stems from the history of the United States. But it's also something that we can find in our societies and European member states as well. And if you can tell someone that he's in the driving seat, or she, I should say, on International Women's Day, happy Women's Day, by the way, that if she's in the driving seat, that is obviously also an advantage. Easements are incredibly flexible tools. The language that goes into easements can be tailored to the circumstances of the specific property, and there's hardly any limit to the creativity that landowners and conservationists can apply when they formulate the easements. There are two important distinctions to be made when you look at easements. One is a formal one, which is the difference between appurtenant easements and easements in growth. The first category, you have a relationship between two adjacent properties, and one, which is called the dominant estate, is somehow exercising rights over the servient estate, which lies next to it. So if you have a property and you have a right of way to trespass, to walk over the adjacent property, this is a classical example of appurtenant easements. Whereas the easements in growth are a relationship between a property owner or a property itself and a legal person. Now that is interesting when you say, my grandmother has the right to pick mushrooms in your forest because that was for some reason her right to do so, and that expires with the death of that person. But if you have that contractual relationship between a legal person that in theory lives forever, for example, a foundation or the state, then these easements and growths can in theory last in perpetuity. So this is something very important to think about when you use easements. Through the mechanism of easements and growth, you can allow for very long, forever basically, time spans. And since land is forever, this is the right tool to protect land. The next category is between negative and positive obligations. Sorry, same slide still. So you can not only say, define what is not allowed on a property to protect conservation values, but you can even say what the landowner has to do in order to protect the conservation values, which is important in the European context where a lot of conservation values are produced, if I may say so, through traditional land uses and the land management practices. And maybe last but not least, the conservation easement is usually cheaper than land purchase. So from the perspective of a conservation NGO or the public, when you want to implement conservation objectives on a private property and the landowner does not agree to that and he is not legally required to do so, the only possibility you have is to buy the land from that person, or in that case, put an easement on that. So you can see if you only define the use rights that are taken away, so to speak, from the owner, that allow for the long-term maintenance or the restoration of certain conservation values, that is only a fraction of the property bundle of rights. So it's also a fraction of the value of these rights. So usually the compensation that you pay for an easement is less than an outright purchase of the entire ownership. Jürgen, I see you already. That means I have to speed up. So next slide, a very quick example. This is the Laubach forest. It's an hour north of Frankfurt, owned by the Count Solms Laubach. And his family owns around 4,000 hectares of forest, 80% of which is protected as Natura 2000. And his family has not seen this only as an infringement, but also as an opportunity to create new revenue streams. And they recently signed an easement on 225 hectares of their beech and oak forest with the NABU Foundation, and turned this forest into wilderness. This has been funded from the German Wilderness Fund, and it will be protected forever as wilderness, so no use, and it's adjacent to state-owned wilderness. So this together creates a beautiful patch of wilderness just an hour north of one of the biggest German cities. So why did the landowner do this? Well, there's a rule in his family, and it's the same rule in many families. You do not sell your land. They have a very strong intergenerational ethic of keeping the property together, but at the same time, they need to make money off the property. And one way was to fell the trees, and another way was to protect the trees. Felling the trees under certain current market conditions would have produced a terrible return on investment. Although the trees are very nice, the timber values are very low right now. So they opted for the second option, and they sold the right to fell the trees for a good price. And so this will be protected, but it required the public subsidy. I'll leave it at that, and I'll come to my conclusions. Next slide, please. So this is where we stand right now. I have some good and bad news. The good news is that conservation easements are possible under practically all the national jurisdictions in the EU right now. We have a study that you can find online at elcn.eu/downloads from 2 years ago that investigated the legal framework for the use of easements for conservation purposes in 25 member states, and it found that in 21 EU member states this is possible. Now the bad news is it has not been widely used yet, the concept, and we are just looking into the reasons why that is the case. We will soon finalize a study, and we will certainly publish the findings in a separate online event. So make sure to subscribe to the Eurosite and ELO and Live ENPLC newsletters to hear about that very soon. We have preliminary findings show us that there's a lack of guidance as how to use easements. There's a lack of integration into the overall EU policies that our colleague Joseph van der Stegen will talk about, and there's a lack of incentives. And Phil has pointed out the importance of financial incentives for private landowners in the United States for entering into easements. So we look at these things also in the framework of our new Live ENPLC project that Eurosite is running together with the ELO and 18 other partners, where we will develop model easement language, test case studies in various member states on how to use the easement concept, and then we'll produce guidance to upscale the instrument in the EU. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion later.
Thank you very much, Tilman. Now, the conservation easement is not the only tool we can use in Europe. There are a number of other conservation tools for individual private landowners in the European Union, and that is exactly the story Anne-Sophie Melier is going to tell us. She's the project officer, project coordinator of the Land is Forever project and working for the European Landowners Organization. Anne-Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to share with you the recommendations based on the outcomes of our LIFE project, Land is Forever. So we started in 2018, and we are very soon finishing in June this year with this project. But as Tilman said, we luckily have already a follow-up project active. So this project, Land is Forever, is coordinated by ILO, and we are working together with the Nature Conservancy and the Flemish Agency for Nature and Forestry, with our main aim to develop recommendations for new and more effective voluntary conservation tools for individual private landowners. And doing so, we also want to expand the use of the conservation methods and also bring landowners together already involved in nature conservation to share information and experiences. Very quick, just to give you a look on the process we've been following. So we started with listing tools and incentives already active in EU and the US. And then we assessed the landowners' understanding with focus groups and in EU survey. We are also engaging governmental agencies to see which tools are already active in which member states. And so all this is now feeding into our recommendations that we are soon discussing with the European Commission, taking into account the reality of individual private landowners. So as you can see, we're really following a very bottom-up approach. So as we said, our aim was to focus on the engagement of individual private landowners, finding a complementary approach of what nature conservation organizations are doing already today. And what we have to take into account to do so is that we respect their entity, their legal entity, their economic entity, and that we find valid business models so that they can do nature conservation, but within their economic reality, knowing that there are a number of ecological needs and that we need a social involvement. And so this brings us to our proposal for the most promising tools and institutions we will be soon recommending based on the project findings. And as you can see, most of them were already mentioned by the two other speakers. So the first one is we want to put forward is also the land trusts. We've already heard about the functioning of the land trusts, and we also have seen that there is a growing interest from private landowners to make use of it. And what's important, as it is in a word, that the land trust is trusted by the individual private landowner. And if they have this trust, they can fulfill various functions and they can use different tools. But the main objective is then that they have the right to secure long-term conservation of land and do so in close cooperation with the private landowner. And in our project, we had one very interesting example that we're setting up. That's a land trust where the land trust can buy on request of a private landowner a piece of land, and where the landowner is interested to manage this piece of land, but he or she is not able to buy it him or herself. And so this land trust can buy the land, and they let the private landowner, mostly neighboring to this land, completely manage this. In the meantime, they secure the conservation of this piece of land. Secondly, the easements, as Tillman already nicely explained. For the easements, we want to keep the definition of the easement as open as possible. So we saw the example where a conservation organization is working with easements with private landowners, but we also saw examples, for example, where a company and a private landowner can agree on a certain easement, or where a landowner or land manager who has already proven his or her skills to manage nature, that they can manage land, public land or land of an organization or a company using an easement. Then the agreements, of course, there already exist various agreements, legally binding or not, with a recognized organization or with a governmental agency. But it would be very nice to have a framework where these agreements can be recognized. And then land designation should always be in agreement with the private landowner, and there should be a benefit or a compensation linked to it. Then strategic partnerships, which can be also very beneficial for private landowners and also for companies when they have to compensate or just for their PR. So as we said, we can come with the most great tools, but if there is no fair compensation or benefit to the landowners that fits with their reality, then they're not likely to be effective. So we've seen in the project that for many individual private landowners, the most preferred compensations are ecosystem payments for ecosystem services and annual payments, because they're easier to include in a business model, and they can be as a value for the next generations. But long-term annual payments are, however, not yet very common, and they can be a very huge challenge given the governmental and policy changes. Another one are the tax benefits, following the good example of the US in labels and awards, because we've seen that they're often a first step, which then can lead to further engagement in nature conservation. They can give a certain benefit to give them public recognition or also market access for their products. Then some keys that we want to put forward in developing the new tools. So first of all, we have the trust and recognition. Of course, trust works in two ways, and it's highly required to have their engagement, and therefore land trust can be of great help here to get individual private landowners on board, as well as successful examples can also help for this. For recognition, we see that certification labels awards are also very helpful. Flexibility and consistency, two important criteria and not always the easiest to combine. And there should be room for changes like climate change, that we have to take care that the commitments that they have to make, that they are still they remain feasible. Said already is the voluntariness of the tool, so we cannot oblige private landowners systematically to do things. We should give them the liberty and the motivation to do so by providing the right tools. Following on this, we are recognizing also the issues that they have engaging in conservation practices. For example, here the graph you see is from a result from our survey that we did with European landowners. And so not only the general ones that you see here are very important, but ideally we should take into account the issues for the private landowner in each separate case. Then it's clear that they very much appreciate a set of tools, that we come up with a menu of tools from which they can choose. We want to keep the menu as broad as possible, so that the European Commission can come up with a set of tools from which the private landowner can choose which are possible for them to engage in. Also important is that we want to introduce nature conservation as a land use through compensation for easements or contractual payments for ecosystem services, that we can equal the amount that a landowner would receive from, for example, renting their land for agriculture, that they can also get this amount for making their land available for conservation. So what we have seen in a certain way is that landowners have mainly picked out those instruments which are already in place for many conservation organizations, or that they're linked to cooperation with them, so that they prefer similar tools on the condition that they are seen as an equal partner in conservation. And so if they're seen as an equal partner, then we see that there are great possibilities to develop further effective tools based on cooperation between the individual private landowners and the organizations. And so that's why we are very much looking forward to our follow-up project that Tilman already told you about, because we want to implement further this great potential in this next live project together with USAID. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to follow the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. Now, tools is one element, but putting tools into the policy practice is another thing. And the region which has been very capable of doing so is Flanders. And so we have the pleasure to have Jan Menschaert with us, who is going to speak about the new Flemish nature legislation, and specifically on the nature management plan in Flanders. Jan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I will try to manage the slides. But in brief, since 3 years, we have a new legislation to be able to make a nature management plan. Before we had all different kinds of concepts to make a management plan, and now we have simplified all of this in one instrument. And in this nature management plan, all types of nature are possible, like forest, heath, open grasslands, and so on and so forth. It's very important that governments, organizations, private owners can use this system. It's the same system for everybody, and everybody has the equal opportunities for the system. And this nature management plan is based on 3 pillars: people, planet, profit. And in every nature management plan, all these 3 pillars are integrated. In this nature management plan, it's made up for 24 years, and every 6 years you have some kind of evaluation to make sure your goals and your ambitions are still okay, and you can evaluate your management plan. This nature management plan, there are 4 different types of nature management plans, and for this 3 different pillars: people, planet, profit, you can choose. It's the choice of the owner to make up your goals and your ambitions. So, for example, for the social function, you can choose if into which degree you wish to invest in the accessibility for visitors. But most importantly, the ecological function, the goals and the ambition that you make there is set up to make the difference in the type of nature management plan. The type 1 is just maintaining current nature values, and from the type 2, it's you choose to improve biodiversity, and you set up at least 25% of ecological objectives. This can be European habitats or other important vegetations. And the type 3 and type 4, you have higher goals of ecological objectives, at least 90%. And in the type 4, there's also, it's the same as the type 3, but with easement, like Tillman told about. And it's your choice of the owner to choose which type you want to make up. But the difference is, the higher your ambition on the ecological function or social function, the higher the subsidies are. These subsidies are different kinds of subsidies. It can be about accessibility for visitors, but also supporting nature management subsidies. These are paid annually. And also there's a partly exempt from inheritance tax and gift tax for the land that is made, the land that is made for a nature management plan. Just one little word about the procedure. There's if you're a private owner of or an organization or a government, we all have to follow the same procedure. And the approval of this nature management plan is split up in two phases. You have an exploration where the nature conservator tells about his ambitions, goals in a simple way, a simple outline. And the next phase in 4 different parts is based on a more detailed content of the management plan, where you set up management goals, management actions, and so on and so forth. That's all I want to say about it. I just had 5 minutes, so I had to make a brief presentation, but I hope it was a little bit clear, the concept of nature management plan in Flanders.
It certainly was, Jan. Thank you very much for that. That brings us to the second part of this webinar today, and that is, well, we are going to ask some people some questions, but let's say we are not only going to ask the people we have around, of course, going to say with us, but around the world with us. But I also would like to invite the audience to answer our questions. I will immediately come to 3 questions, and it would be very interesting if you too at home could assist us with answering those questions, or if you would have additional questions, please do share them with us. For that, you can make use of the chat function in this webinar software, which you normally find on the right side. And let's say you have a number of different possibilities. If you take the chat one, you can type your message, you can send it, and then we will have a look, and we will, if necessary, if we have too much questions, we will make our choice. But otherwise, we will try to get your questions to the different panelists we have. And we have 3 panelists this afternoon, and I have to say, not the least ones. The first one is Joseph van der Stegen. He's Policy Officer for the Director General Environment at the European Commission. The second one is Chandni Navalka. She's Associate Director of the ILCN. And we have Jacob Ledecker, the Head of Operations of the National Park de Hoge Veluwe, or in the Netherlands better known as the man with the greatest job in the Netherlands. So that are the 3 panelists, and I will ask the organizer to switch from our speakers to the 3 panelists. That is excellent. Thank you very much for that. And the first one I would like to give the floor is Joseph van der Stegen. Joseph, you don't only are going to present a little bit about the Commission policies, but you will also try to answer some of the 3 questions, which we can find on the next slide. And the first question is about the tools for private land conservation. And the question is, which of those tools now should we include? And then which important criteria should we take into account? But as everything has to fit within the European policy, how can this contribute to the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030? But for that, we would like to know also a little bit more about that biodiversity strategy, and that is an answer we are already going to get from Joseph van der Stegen. Joseph, the floor is yours. And Joseph, we do not hear you. I will ask our back office to switch on your microphone. That should be working now.
Yes, thank you, Jürgen. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for some. So thank you for the invitation and for giving me and the Commission the occasion to express our views on this important topic of enhancing the contribution of private landowners to nature conservation. So I'm doing this presentation in collaboration with my colleagues Joachim Capitao and Frank Vassen. Next slide. Yes, I will start with a bit of context. So the EU has adopted a new EU biodiversity strategy. It is ambitious, and for that we need the contribution of all stakeholders, and in particular of the landowners. And the aim of the biodiversity strategy is to better protect our nature, to better manage it, and to restore the degraded ecosystems. And for that, there are specific targets which relate, for instance, for the designation of protected area. The ambition is to have 30% of the EU designated as a protected area, and of which 1/3 would be strictly protected. But we have also other targets related to the organic agriculture, related to restoration of rivers, and also to the fact of having landscape features in the landscape. So many targets where the landowners can contribute. On this slide, I have tried to show where the landowners, individual private landowners, could contribute on a voluntary basis in the EU. I'm insisting on the voluntary basis because, as said previously by others and Tillman, we have the legal basis, and that's everybody has to comply with it. But then we can go beyond, and we are talking about the beyond here. So the landowners, private landowners, can contribute to the protected areas first. And the protected areas, among the protected areas in the EU, we have the Natura 2001 network. It's already 18% of the EU, but we have the ambition to increase that percentage to 30%. So the private landowners can contribute to the management of the existing protected areas, and that's a legal obligation, but they can go beyond. And they can also contribute by the designation of protected areas on a voluntary basis. That's the blue part of the graph. And of course, this is ambitious and demanding for the landowners. And then we have the other one, the green part of the graph, which relates to the contribution in the so-called wider countryside. So in the non-protected part of the countryside, where we need to restore rivers, we need to increase the conservation of habitats and species. So many occasions to contribute to the EU nature goals. And this is an occasion also to build a bottom-up approach to the conservation policy, because this part is not always been, has sometimes been a bit forgotten. Now, how can landowners contribute to the EU biodiversity strategy? Actually, we want to have more nature thanks to more landowners using more ambitious tools. And for that, we need a menu, a set of tools, as already said. And some tools will be more ambitious than others. And the purpose of this graph is to show that we are now in 2021, but we want to reach 2030 with more landowners embarking with more ambitious tools for more nature in the EU. Next slide. Yes. So we need the landowners, we need for more nature, and what are the opportunities for them, how to have them on board. For that, we need several conditions probably, and that's the view not of the landowners here, but that's the view of a public authority from the EU level. So first of all, as said, we are not talking about legal instruments, we are talking here about voluntary instruments that will enable to have a bottom-up approach. And those instruments need, first of all, to be efficient in terms of nature, of course, because we want to have more nature, we want to have the right choice be made where it needs to be done. So it should be good for nature, that's obvious, but good to remind. But on the other side, it should be also attractive for landowners, otherwise we won't have them on board. And that's for the landowners to say what will be good for them, but probably that, stability is an important factor. Clarity also is an important element of any decision, and also probably some kind of return. In terms of return, we can talk about money, returns in terms of money, but not only. Like subsidies, but also sometimes economic payback is important, and it can also be just the recognition that such one landowner has done done something good for nature, that can count. And also just sometimes the pleasure of enjoying nature will be a sufficient driver for landowner to do more. One important aspect is also probably the long-term perspective. Of course, there might be different types of commitments, but the commitments for nature will be better if they have a long-term dimension, because it's easy to understand for nature. Nature needs time to react, so better if we have long-term commitments for nature. But it's also probably good for the landowners who want to have clarity. So both go in the same direction. And in case of a partnership, it's of course good to build things over time, because it's a way of building trust over time. And if public money is involved, it's also important to have a long-term perspective, because the public institutions want to invest money and not to lose the investment the day after. Now, the instruments, they won't be one EU instruments, that's one size fits all instrument. That's not possible. They need to fit with the regional, the regional or the national context. So there will be different tools, but and they can exploit at different level. Another important aspect is partnership. The delivery in terms of nature will be better if people work together, build partnerships, and build on transparency. These are very important conditions to build long-term and fruitful actions for nature. And then communication is good, and especially communication by peers, because they are the best to communicate to their fellow landowners. I go to the next slides and then I'll finish. Jürgen, what are the preferred instruments for the Commission? I would say that there is no preferred instruments. We would say that the best instruments are those that fulfill many of the conditions I have mentioned before, and there are overlaps between tools. That's why it's also not easy to determine that one is better. But of course, the ones that have been described before are very good, because I am talking about land conservation easements, land trust, because they have this long-term perspective and they build this key partnership where people not used to work together will work together in trust. And then we have the subsidies, the tax benefits, that's traditional and it will continue. Labels and awards are also very good, because they build on the recognition of what people can do, and they can have a snowball effect on which we believe it is important. And then it's not only the instruments that count, but also it's the content of the instruments, of course. What is the duration of the instrument? What is the objective of the instrument? What transparency within it? So those two will allow to build new instruments or expand existing ones. And we hope that the landowners, I mean, we know that they do already a lot, but we hope that they will embark more on those tools to demonstrate what they do and to scale up, really to scale up what they do to achieve the goals of the EU biodiversity, sorry, with all the partners on board. And I will just finish with a picture of a recent oversight where a recent agreement between a landowner and a conservation NGO has been signed, just as a demonstration of the feasibility of the thing and the need to scale it up. Thank you very much, Jürgen.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for giving us this introduction into the EU biodiversity strategy and also for answering our questions. We have also asked our questions to our next panelist, that is Chandni Navalka. She's Associate Director, Sustainably Managed Land and Water Resources of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. She's also active within the International Land Conservation Network. And she's our guest today from the United States. So we're moving over the ocean to ask Chandni what she thinks about those tools and instruments for private land conservation in Europe. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thanks for the opportunity to be here to reflect with this group. I'm joining you here today on behalf, as Jürgen mentioned, of the International Land Conservation Conservation Network, which is a global network for private land conservation based at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy here in the United States. I'm going to try to change my slide. Just a bit about the ILCN. The network was founded in 2015 to fill a need to exchange expertise, lessons, and innovations among organizations and practitioners from the many countries in which private land conservation is being practiced in and outside the EU member states. And this map shows a snapshot of the organizations and networks we connect and partner with globally, which is evolving as the network grows. And from the beginning of the network, some of our key partners have been Philip at TNC and Tillman at the ELCN, through which we've gotten to know ELO. And so it's exciting to be here today to continue this conversation about what it will take to advance private land conservation in the EU in the context of growing global commitment to the 30 by 30 target. So I just wanted to preface my feedback, if I can move to the next slide, on the tools and criteria for PLC in the EU, by noting that beyond the United States, there's a lot of varied experience in non-EU countries in which private land conservation is well established or emerging. And I've just listed here some countries that represent different legal systems and land ownership regimes and how they're using or adapting the easement concept from Chile to New Zealand to China, or using other tools such as biodiversity stewardship agreements, as in South Africa. And to reiterate a lot of what the speakers here have shared, whether private land conservation is well established or emerging, the opportunities and challenges facing its practice pretty much everywhere are to do largely with finance, partnerships, and capacity. So I just wanted to set the stage with that before I answered the questions posed by Jürgen to the panelists. So the question of which tools should be included in the PLC menu for the EU, rather than choosing a set of tools, like Joseph said, a set of tools can be chosen that accomplish multiple things. But I think three really important things are, first, that the tools strengthen the protection of existing privately conserved land in Europe, such as that within the Natura 2000 network. And then in terms of voluntary options for landowners, that the tools empower willing and motivated landowners who are ready to take long-term conservation action on their land, like the example shared by Tillman from Germany earlier. And also that the tools, or the mix of tools, offers a way of meeting landowners where they are in order to recognize what they're doing and build trust so that they consider taking longer-term action or more ambitious action in the future. And I think the typology that was offered earlier by Jan in Flanders is a really interesting and good one for how to do that. And just so from this, the menu of tools might comprise a mix of voluntary binding and non-binding mechanisms or tools, including easements or contracts, but also non-binding agreements that recognize existing stewardship or reward and incentivize management for conservation. And this is particularly important in priority areas like interstitial lands between already protected lands. And for example, Australia and South Africa are two countries which offer landowners multiple kinds of agreements with different levels of restrictions and time horizons, from establishing privately protected areas which are included in national protected area systems to relatively short-term agreements to manage land for biodiversity. And I think whether legally binding or non-binding, I think all of the speakers here have emphasized that the tools or mechanisms should include or be backed by long-term financial incentives, whether that takes the form of compensatory payments, tax benefits, cost sharing, labeling, or technical assistance, and that these incentives be based on clear outcomes. And then I think Philip, in his first presentation, alluded to what may also be a key instrument, which is accessible and comprehensive conservation science information and spatial data on existing protected lands. And this is central for organizations and landowners to be able to partner and to take a strategic approach to prioritizing conservation on private lands. So moving to the question about the criteria to take into account when compiling the PLC tools menu, I won't repeat a lot of what other panelists and speakers have said, but I think all of them have touched on how well can the tool or instrument bridge the needs of nature conservation and the landowner. And this speaks to whether it's economically viable for the landowner to use the tool and that enables them to enact their values and motivations on their land. That it accommodates sustainable land uses and that clear conservation objectives can be met while allowing for adaptation and flexibility to changing conditions like those created by climate change. It's also really important that there's a strong supportive infrastructure for the effectiveness and longevity of the tool or instrument. And this is really clear in the experience of many countries, that beyond whether the tool is backed by existing legislation and policy, which is just a kind of prerequisite, it's also necessary that there are processes in place that are well understood, that there are clear roles and responsibilities for the involved parties, that there are strong and capable organizations, both public and private, who are able to forge relationships with landowners and ready to meet the operational and technical challenges to both establishing conserved lands on private land and monitoring the tool. And of course, that there's sustainable and renewable financing in place. And if all of this infrastructure is not in place, one of the questions to ask is what will it take to get there? And this is a good example in Chile, where even as easements are moving forward, the government is still in the process of determining the tax treatment and incentives for their establishment. And then lastly, I think a really important criteria is, does the tool or instrument foster trust amongst the people and organizations involved and the public, whether at the national or international scale? And this speaks to whether the tool is enforceable, measurably effective, and will result in an area that is countable towards the 30 by 30 target. Another way to put this is that it helps landowners and countries meet the international guidelines and definitions like those that have been created by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature for privately protected areas or effectively conserved areas. And in terms of fostering trust, does the tool encourage partnership and transparency, both of which were really important points made by Joseph in terms of building meaningful relationships between stakeholders in the landscape. And Jürgen, I see your video has popped up, so I'll just answer your last question, which is how can individual landowners contribute to the biodiversity strategy in 2030? And I think that the answer to that is really through partnership, by putting landowners' experience and expertise towards developing a shared vision and providing input into the strategic approach that we're working to develop here, and also by helping to build civil society support for conservation, which is the only way in which it will really be sustainable in the long term. And Philip also touched on the landscape scale perspective, and this is where that landscape scale approach comes in. It's about encouraging cooperation amongst landowners, NGOs, and governments to reduce the barriers to working together, to share risk, to promote regulatory and process efficiencies, and to grow that public trust in conservation as a viable long-term land use that has multiple social and economic benefits. So thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, thank you very, very much for this overseas view on private land conservation tools. Our last panelist is Jacob Ledecker. He's head of operations of the Nationaal Park de Hoge Veluwe, which is a privately owned and managed park in the Netherlands, which means that in reality, due to travel restrictions, it is as far as the United States. So, Jacob, floor is yours. One moment, Jacob, we do not hear you. I will ask our back office to switch on your mic. That should be the case. But I do not hear you. I don't know if you can, from your place, switch on the mic. It was working earlier on. But sometimes things have to go wrong. what I'm going to do, Jacob, I will ask Marie to remove you for a moment from our screen so that you can try to solve the problem with her. She can give you a phone call, and then I will go on with Joseph and Chantney, because I have some additional questions coming into the chat. First of all, Chantney, I would like to see, because up to now I have been asking, okay, what kind of tools do you think we can use? But what are the lessons learned in the United States? What should we not do?
So the question you're flipping to us is, what should you not do? Well, I would say it's really important to move at the speed of trust. So it's really important to get landowner input, NGO input, and public entity or government input into creating the strategic process for creating these tools and having the infrastructure set up to, as I mentioned, to support the use and implementation and the proliferation of the tools. So I would say that while it's urgent to move quickly to meet the 30 by 30 target and the EU biodiversity strategy, it's also important to move at that speed that works to ensure that everybody is, all the relevant stakeholders are able to join together to create that shared vision.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that Jacob is back. So I hope that that means that his microphone is working now. And Jacob is back, but his microphone is not working. Okay, so I have to give you back to the back office. Let's hope that you're able to solve that. If possible, I would like to have Jan Mensgaard also back on the screen, because I have a specific question for him. But in the meantime, there we have Jan. And Jan, one of the questions I got was referring to the Flanders example, which has been in place now for 3 years, and whether you would be able to give some comments on how this has been taken up and what you have learned about the first 3 years of this program. And can I ask the back office to open your microphone? Because otherwise we're going to have a similar problem.
Okay, I think you can hear me.
We do. Please go.
Okay. Well, in 3 years, it's clear that the system is working. It's a voluntary system, but half of the area which is made by private owners. So, of course, nature organizations and government make up a lot of nature management plans, but also the private owners are a very interesting group to work with. That's it.
And I don't know if you have some figures. I do know that, let's say, for the
50%, half of the area is made by private owners.
Okay, and you have any idea what the contribution of individual private landowners is to that?
What do you mean, Jürgen?
Well, I know that let's say, especially in Type 4, there are especially nature conservation organizations who are also private.
Yeah, but also in Type 4 with the easements, some private owners are interested.
Yeah, don't worry. That is Jacob who's testing his microphone. And yes, Jacob.
Most of the private owners choose for the system the Type 2, but some private owners also are interested for the Type 4, the highest ambitions with easement. So I think it's working.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I would like to ask you, Joseph, if we look at the Common Agriculture Policy of the European Union, we see that all kinds of payments are foreseen for agricultural activities, but also for farmers being active in nature conservation. Is a payment for ecosystem services, which is an instrument which was not mentioned, but would that be a good initiative towards private landowners? Wait, Joseph, you have the same problem. Can we switch on? Yes, your microphone should be on now. Please do so.
First of all, you know, the reform of the CAP is the attribution first of the DG Agri. We intervened in the debate, of course, but I mean, currently we have, and we'll continue to have the agri-environmental measures, which are for 5-year commitments towards for nature, and in a way it's an ecosystem services, and there is a payment for that ecosystem services. And of course that's a good approach. The problem is that maybe sometimes after 5 years we lose what we have invested for. So sometimes it's a bit of pity, but maybe there are new approaches which are investigated within the CAP, like the result-based payment schemes. I won't expand on that, but that's rather promising and can expand on the good aspects of that. Beyond that, I'm not aware, and I'm not in DG Agri, so I'm not aware of all the details, but I think, I mean, indeed, rewarding the landowners or the farmers for what they do for nature is a good approach and will be further expanded and further explored within certain limits, and I don't know all the limits.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, for that. We have Jacob back with us, and let's hope the microphone is working.
Can you hear me, Jürgen?
And it is working. I have to say that's the first time I know someone who is able to shut you up. Okay.
I do think that the distance between Belgium and Holland is too far, so the connection is not good enough. Well, in the preparation of the subject, I asked myself what a Hoge Veluwe all is, and are we a company or are we a nature conservation area? And my conclusion is that I can't answer this question. It's a little bit of both, or a lot of both. And isn't that a part of the question today? In my experience, people are trying to separate these two. I don't know why, but earning money and nature conservation can be hand in hand. In total, the economic spin-off of the Hoge Veluwe in the region is calculated as 70 million euros a year. That's around 1,400 jobs in the region. And you could say that we're one of the economic motors in our province. The biggest part of is directly connected to residents' accommodations. We are a foundation with a profit motive. Without a profit motive, all the revenues are directly invested in our park again. And within 5 years, we raised our budget from 500,000 to 600,000 paying visitors and succeeded in that. I think that we succeeded because we are thinking as entrepreneurs and not as nature conservationists on on that point. Next slide, please. When you look at our exploitation overview, you can see that over 80% of our income is coming from the paying visitors and a bit more of 10% from subsidies. You can also see that despite of the economic crisis in 2008, we succeeded to have an exploitation stable in the beginning and let it grow with more than 2 million in 10 years. The income of a park, so forestry, hunting revenues, and so on, is more or less the same over the years. And you could say that the park is an entrepreneur, as an entrepreneur can handle its own business. Next slide, please. As a nature conservation area, over 30% of a park is pointed as Natura 2000 habitat. Next to that, around 20% of a park is pointed as potential habitat. The biggest values are within the drift sand and heathland, so the open landscapes and old forests. The open landscapes can stay open, not because we are fanatic in cutting trees, but mainly because around 150 volunteers help us maintaining the open areas open. That based on a long-term management plan. Next slide, please. 8 out of 10 bird directive species are found back at the Hoge Veluwe. The other 2 are extincted in Holland. Next slide, please. We are also the last, or one of the last finding places of several very rare flora and fauna in Holland. We do know so because we have a very enthusiastic volunteering group and around 50, most of the time retired biologists who help us doing the inventories. We are convinced that because we divide our park into areas where we can have more or less visitors from the beginning of the foundation in our park in 1935 is the basis of the success. Not only as a company, but also as a nature conservation area. Next to that, we don't believe in that doing nothing is good for biodiversity, knowing that the planet in a total is influenced by humans. Next slide, please. The question is, how can this be achieved? Is the basis of several management plans from the park and governments or several scientific researches and laws? Next slide, please. Or is it based on local knowledge from workers in the field and people who live in local communities and who are born and raised in certain villages over there? We think that it's a combination of both. Management plans of our park are most of the time already written. The base is rather stable and looking at the long term. The practical translation of the plans is done outside because outside you can see the nuance of the written words. Next slide, please. To stay sharp at the goals, but also to be aware of the results of the work landowners do, not only politically, but also for the landowners themselves. They may be more aware of the fact that they are a spin in the web of nature conservation. Labels will help. Next slide, please. Looking at the questions, I've answered them to reflect. The first is, which of the 3 are promising instruments to be implemented in the future? What I miss is the faith in the good work of private landowners. It looks like that biodiversity can only be managed by NGOs. I think the opposite. The basis of that thought is that private landowners have a feeling with the grounds and landscape, the nature, and so on. They are born and raised there. Most of the managers of NGOs are, most of the time, hardworking, but have not don't have any direct history within these areas. When private land stays within the family, future landowners are brought up with the goals of their state. So long-term management goals are guaranteed. And that's what biodiversity needs, long-term management goals, not jumping from one to the other subsidy pot, which changes every election. No, using the chances there are and to support these on the long term. Next slide, please. The second question was, which of the most important criteria which should be taken into account? When private landowners are accepted as good guards of the landscape, just accept them as they are, the most important goal they have is to maintain the legacy and to give it in a healthy state to the next generation. Next slide, please. And the last question was, how can individual landowners contribute to the Biodiversity Strategy 2030? I don't know whether this question is a good one. I'm convinced that the question should be, how can the biodiversity strategy contribute to local landowners to maintain landscape and biodiversity in Europe? Only then biodiversity gets what it needs. That's a long-term management goal. Next, last slide, please. I want to finish with this picture in which you can see the balance between earning money and biodiversity. This is achieved by maintaining the same management strategy over years. You can see a lot of people looking at a deer at a distance of 50 meters or something. Thank you, Jurgen.
Well, thank you, Jakob. And while your microphone is working, I do have a question. We have heard that for individual private landowners, financial incentives can be important. For the national park, how important are financial incentives like subsidies?
Well, we have subsidies up to 10%. For us, it's free money, and the rest we earn ourselves. We can also do our work without subsidies, but then we have to look at our management goals.
Yeah, but of course that is something which is possible for a large organization like yours, but much less evident for an individual private landowner with a small holding. Okay, thank you very much, Jakob. I also would like to thank the two other panelists. We are coming to the end of our webinar today. I would like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank our panelists, but I also would like to thank our webinar wizard in the back office, which is Marie Orban. Thank you very much, Marie, for organizing this webinar. You have spent a lot of time in it in the last weeks. But I also would like to thank the organization team behind the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, where we have a highly skilled team under the supervision of Caroline Maar. Caroline, you too, and your team, thank you very much for what you have been doing. And there are still 2 busy weeks coming on. And ladies and gentlemen, please join us, watch the webinars. There are still many to come.